1938, Quantico, Virginia. The surf pounded the beach as a U.S. Marine officer scribbled his frustration in a worn notebook. There has to be a better way. This is madness. The Navy's Bureau of Ships keeps telling us to accept their designs, but they refuse to listen to our needs. He had just watched his Marines struggle from a prototype landing craft. They spent an entire exercise just trying to get ashore, climbing over the high steel sides of the boat, wading through deep water under theoretical fire. Hours of labor and high casualties just to land one platoon. The traditional method demanded wading, patience, and precious time. Time that America did not have, as war clouds gathered over the Pacific and Europe. Yet here, in what was supposed to be the testing ground for amphibious warfare, the methods were the same as they had been for decades. What none of the Navy supervisors at the Bureau knew was that a civilian boat builder in New Orleans, a loud-mouthed Irishman named Andrew Jackson Higgins, had already solved their problem. And what the Navy did not yet know was that his simple solution, rejected and dismissed, would soon save the United States. It would not just save time. It would save hundreds of thousands of lives and fundamentally change amphibious warfare forever. The transformation had begun weeks earlier, in the murky swamps of Louisiana, where the real war against inefficiency was being fought every single day. The date was 1938. The U.S. Marine Corps, tasked with developing the doctrine for a future Pacific war, faced a terrifying problem. They had to find a way to move men from a ship, across a coral reef, and onto a hostile beach, all while under machine gun fire. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, BUShips, was responsible for designing the boats. But BUShips was a rigid, tradition-bound bureaucracy. Their engineers, based in Washington, D.C., were designing boats for the Navy, not for the Marines. They prioritized seaworthiness over assault capability. Their primary design was a 30-foot F-boat. It was heavy, slow, and had a deep draft. It could not cross a reef. Worse, it could not run onto the beach. Troops had to climb over the high steel sides and drop into the water, completely exposed. Marine officers who tested the boats were horrified. They called them death traps. They knew that in a real war, these boats would lead to a massacre. The Marines were being asked to invent a new type of warfare, but the Navy was giving them 19th century tools to do it. The Marines were desperate. They searched everywhere for a solution, and that search led them to Andrew Jackson Higgins, a civilian boat builder in New Orleans. Higgins was a brilliant, hard-drinking, and notoriously profane character who was already famous for one thing: building boats for shallow water. Higgins Industries built boats for loggers, trappers, and oil drillers in the Louisiana bayous. These men needed a boat that could run at high speed in shallow water, hit a sandbar or a log and not be damaged. Higgins had invented the perfect solution. His Eureka boat had a spoonbill bow and a recessed propeller. This unique design allowed it to run right up onto a beach or riverbank at full speed, and then, by reversing the engine, pull itself off again. It was a shallow draft marvel. The Marines tested the 36-foot Eureka boat. They were stunned. It did everything the Navy's boat could not. It was fast, it could cross reefs, and it could run directly onto the beach, protecting the men until the last second. They had found their boat. But the Navy's Bureau of Ships hated it, and they hated Andrew Higgins. He was a civilian, an outsider. He had not followed procedure. His boat was not invented here. The admirals in Washington refused to approve it, insisting that their own flawed F-boat was the standard. This began a bitter bureaucratic war. The Marines, the users, wanted the Higgins boat. The Navy, the procurers, refused, placing orders for their own inferior design. The Navy even tried to steal Higgins' design and build their own less effective copy. It was bureaucratic madness. Higgins was furious. He was a patriot, but he was also a brawler. He insulted the Navy admirals publicly. He used his political connections. He knew a war was coming, and he knew the boat the Navy was building would get American boys killed. The situation was at a stalemate. The Marines had a doctrine that required the Higgins boat. The Navy had a bureaucracy that demanded their own. Then, a single piece of intelligence, delivered by a young Marine officer, changed everything. In 1940, Lieutenant Victor Krulak returned from observing the Japanese in China. He showed Higgins a photograph of a small Japanese landing craft. It had a feature that neither the Navy's boat nor Higgins's Eureka boat had: a bow ramp. Higgins looked at the crude photograph. He famously grabbed a piece of chalk, sketched a new design on the factory floor, and told his engineers to build it. He had combined his high-performance Eureka hull with the Japanese ramp concept. The modern landing craft, the LCVP, was born. He presented this new boat, the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP, to the Navy. It was the perfect weapon. It could carry 36 men or a jeep and a squad, hit the beach at speed, drop its ramp, unload, and be gone in 30 seconds. The Navy's Bureau of Ships still rejected it. They were now 3 years into their own failed development. They could not admit that this loud-mouthed civilian in New Orleans had solved a problem that their entire engineering bureau could not. They stuck to their side-loading boat. Higgins, in desperation, ignored the Navy. He built the new LCVP with his own money. He knew that when the crisis came, the admirals would have no choice. The Marines, led by visionary officers, were testing his boats in secret, in defiance of ships. This was the core of the problem. The Navy's bureaucracy was willing to risk losing a war and sacrificing thousands of Marines, rather than admit that their internal process was wrong. It was a classic case of not invented here syndrome. Higgins, a man who had dropped out of college, was running circles around the Navy's top engineers. He had done it by listening to the users, the trappers, the loggers, and now the Marines. The Navy was listening only to its own internal committees. The crisis finally came to a head. The Marines were preparing for war. They needed a boat, and the Navy's official model had just failed its tests again. The Marines, in an act of institutional desperation, decided to bypass the Navy entirely. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Thomas Holcomb, went directly to the United States Congress. In a dramatic, closed-door hearing, he and his top planners essentially declared war on the Navy's procurement system. Holcomb told the shocked congressman that the Navy's boat was a death trap, and that the only boat that could win the coming war was the one built by Andrew Higgins. He was staking the Marine Corps' entire future on a boat built by a civilian the Navy loathed. The political pressure was immense. Congress, stunned by the testimony, forced the Navy's hand. The Bureau of Ships was humiliated. They were ordered against their will to stop work on their own boat and give the contract to Higgins Industries. Higgins had won. He had bet his entire company, his fortune, and his reputation on the simple idea that the men fighting the war should get the tools they actually needed, not the tools the bureaucracy wanted them to have. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. Suddenly, the demand was not for a few hundred boats for testing. The demand was for tens of thousands, and the only man in the world who could build them was Andrew Higgins. Higgins's small workshop on St. Charles Avenue exploded. He received government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He took over 8 city blocks. He hired thousands of workers. He had to build an armada, and he had to do it overnight. He shattered every production record. He pioneered mass production assembly lines for boats, just as Ford had done for cars. He built a new massive factory on the Industrial Canal. The Navy, which had fought him for years, was now completely and totally dependent on his genius. The Bureau of Ships, which had dismissed his unprofessional designs, now watched as Higgins Industries became the largest single employer in Louisiana, with over 25,000 workers. They were no longer a small boatyard. They were a national strategic asset. Higgins' hiring practices were as revolutionary as his boats. In the segregated South, he hired women, African Americans, the elderly, and the physically disabled. He paid them all equal wages, telling skeptics, "If they can do the job, I don't care what color they are." His factories operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The LCVPs rolled off the assembly lines at a rate that stunned the world. Higgins was not just building boats. He was proving that American innovation, when unleashed from bureaucracy, could overwhelm any enemy. The first test came in 1942. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. For the first time, LCVPs were used in a major assault. They ran through the surf, hit the beaches, and dropped their ramps. The doctrine the Marines had dreamed of, and Higgins had built, worked. Then came Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in 1943. Thousands of American and British soldiers hit the beaches in Higgins' boats. The ramp, the simple innovation the Navy had rejected, was proving to be the single most important piece of technology in the Allied arsenal. Then came Italy, the bloody landings at Salerno. Here the LCVP's true value was shown. The boats navigated minefields and dodged artillery fire to land wave after wave of men, keeping the beachhead supplied by a thread. The old Navy F-boat would have failed in the first 10 minutes, but the ultimate test was yet to come. June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. As the sun rose, the largest armada in human history approached the coast of France, and at the tip of the spear were thousands of LCVPs. Every American soldier who landed on Omaha and Utah Beach came in a Higgins boat. Every British and Canadian soldier who landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword came in a craft based on Higgins' design. The entire invasion was staked on his invention. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, not a man known for overstatement, would later make a definitive declaration. He said that Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. He was not talking about a general or an admiral. He was talking about the loudmouthed Welder from Nebraska. Eisenhower explained his reasoning. Without the LCVP, he said, the entire strategy of the war would have been different. They would not have been able to land on an open, hostile beach. The D-Day landings, as we know them, would have been logistically and tactically impossible. The workhorse of the fleet was not a battleship or a carrier. It was this small 36-foot plywood boat. The ramp, which had been dismissed by Washington bureaucrats, was the key that unlocked Fortress Europe. It allowed the Allies to bypass fortified ports and attack anywhere. But the war was being fought on two fronts. At the exact same time, the LCVP was winning the war in the Pacific. The Marines, who had first championed the boat, were now using it to execute their island-hopping campaign. At Guadalcanal, the first brutal test, LCVPs were the logistical lifeline. At Tarawa, they were the only craft that could get over the treacherous coral reef in numbers, though many were destroyed. They proved that a massed assault from the sea was possible. At Iwo Jima, the LCVPs burrowed into the black volcanic sand, landing waves of Marines and their equipment under the most horrific fire of the war. They delivered tanks, bulldozers, and artillery, allowing the Marines to fight their way inland. At Okinawa, the final great battle, an armada of over 1,000 LCVPs and other Higgins-designed craft landed the 10th Army. They were the logistical backbone of the entire campaign, proving that Higgins's Bayou boat could conquer an ocean. The statistics are staggering. By the end of the war, Higgins Industries had built 23,158 boats. Over 20,000 of those were the LCVP. This one civilian company had built more naval vessels than the entire Japanese Navy. The Bureau of Ships, the bureaucracy that had fought him for 3 years, had been reduced to a rubber stamp for his invoices. The experts in Washington had been proven catastrophically wrong, and the outsider from New Orleans had been proven right. The admirals who had dismissed his idea as unprofessional now had to admit that the entire U.S. Navy, and the fate of the free world, was riding on his plywood boats. It was the ultimate vindication of an innovator who refused to take no for an answer. But what if he had? What if Higgins, like so many others, had given up when the Navy said no? What if he had accepted the procedure and the specifications from the admirals who had never seen a hostile beach? D-Day would have failed. The landings in the Pacific would have been impossible. The war would have dragged on for years longer, costing millions more lives. The bureaucratic stubbornness of a handful of men in Washington would have changed the course of human history. Higgins' story is a lesson in innovation. It is a lesson that the user on the front line, the Marine in the surf, knows more than the engineer in the distant office. It is a lesson that procedure is often the enemy of victory. After the war, Higgins' company, like Nelson's, faced an uncertain future. Military orders dried up. He tried to pivot to civilian boats and housing, but he was a wartime production genius, not a peacetime businessman. The company eventually failed, but his legacy was secure. He was not a welder seeking fame. He was a boat builder who saw a problem and fixed it. He was a patriot who understood that in a total war, the most important thing is to get the tools to the troops, even if it means breaking every rule. The history of innovation is filled with these figures. The cranks, the outsiders, the loudmouths who are dismissed by the experts. But these are the people who see the world differently. They are not trapped by the way it has always been done. Higgins, like Ted Nelson, saw the problem from the ground up. He knew what a boat needed to do. The Navy bureaucracy only knew what a boat was supposed to be. That small difference was the difference between victory and defeat. The LCVP, a simple boat of plywood and steel, became the symbol of American industrial might. But it was also a symbol of American ingenuity and the power of a single, stubborn individual to defy a system and win a war. The strategic impact of the LCVP was incalculable. It did not just move men, it changed geography. Before Higgins, an amphibious assault had to target a port. This made defense easy, heavily fortify the ports. After Higgins, every beach was a potential landing site. This simple boat completely nullified billions of dollars in enemy coastal fortifications. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a concrete fortress stretching for thousands of miles, was rendered tactically obsolete. The Allies didn't have to break through it. They could simply land between its strongest points. The psychological impact on the enemy was just as profound. Japanese defenders on a Pacific island could no longer just defend the one deep-water harbor. They had to defend every beach. This stretched their forces impossibly thin, making them vulnerable everywhere. The LCVP was the key to this new, flexible, and terrifyingly fast-paced warfare. It was the physical embodiment of the new American doctrine. It was not just a boat, it was a strategic weapon, as important as the B-17 bomber or the M4 Sherman tank. And it almost never existed. The Navy's Bureau of Ships fought Andrew Higgins for 3 years. Their own design, the 30-foot F-boat, was a complete failure. It was slow, it drew too much water, and it forced Marines to climb over its 8-foot-high steel sides. In tests, it took an entire platoon almost 10 minutes to disembark from the Navy's boat, leaving them exposed and bunched up in the water. With the LCVP, the same platoon could disembark, dry shod on the beach, in less than 30 seconds. The difference was not a matter of efficiency, it was a matter of life and death. Those 9.5 minutes were the difference between a successful landing and a massacre. The admirals in Washington, obsessed with their own procedures, had been designing a boat that would have killed thousands. Higgins, in his public rants, had called the Navy's boat a coffin. He was not exaggerating. He was stating a simple, tactical fact. The bureaucracy, safe in their DC offices, had been willing to send American men to die in those coffins to protect their own pride. The Navy's final desperate attempt to stop Higgins was to steal his design. They obtained the plans for his Eureka boat and had another contractor build a copy. It was a disaster. Lacking Higgins's specialized knowledge, the copy was heavier, slower, and the ramp failed. This complete failure, combined with the pressure from Congress and the Marines, was what finally broke the stalemate. The Navy was forced to capitulate. They had to admit in 1941 that their entire small boat program was a failure, and that Higgins was the only answer. Once the contracts were signed, Higgins's true genius was revealed. He was not just an inventor, he was a production visionary. His main factory in New Orleans was a miracle of organization. He applied mass production assembly lines to boat building, something no one had ever done. The factory operated 24/7. Raw lumber entered one end, and a finished LCVP rolled out the other every 58 minutes. This relentless pace was what supplied the armadas for both the Atlantic and the Pacific. He was building boats faster than the enemy could sink them. His workforce was a testament to his pragmatism. He hired anyone who could do the job. His integrated workforce of over 25,000 men and women, black and white, was a social revolution in the segregated South. He simply did not have time for prejudice. The U.S. Navy, which had fought him for so long, was now his biggest supporter. They had to be. Their entire war strategy, from the mind of Admiral King to the beaches of Normandy, was now totally dependent on Higgins Industries. The outsider was now the foundation. Higgins' impact was not just the LCVP. He built larger landing craft, the LCM, landing craft mechanized, which could carry a 30-ton Sherman tank. He built PT boats. His company designed and built over 70 different types of craft. The numbers are a testament to this industrial miracle. While 23,000 LCVPs were the most famous, his company built over 27,000 vessels in total. This one man, in one city, had built the vast majority of the U.S. Navy's landing fleet. Higgins, unlike the bureaucratic Navy admirals, was a hands-on leader. He stalked his factory floors 18 hours a day, famously firing people on the spot for inefficiency, and just as famously handing out $100 bills to workers who suggested a good idea. He was a force of nature. The Navy's estimate of the time saved is almost impossible to calculate. It wasn't man-hours like on Nelson's submarines. It was years saved on the duration of the war itself. The D-Day landings, impossible without Higgins, are estimated to have shortened the war by at least a year. The LCVP was not a complex machine. It was made of plywood, protected by a thin layer of steel. Its engine was a simple 225 horsepower grey marine diesel, the same used in city buses. It was cheap, disposable, and could be built by semi-skilled labor. This was its genius. It was the complete opposite of a battleship. It was a weapon of mass production, designed to be lost. The Allies could afford to lose hundreds of LCVPs on a beach because Higgins was building thousands more. This philosophy, quantity has a quality all its own, was something the rigid Navy bureaucracy had failed to grasp. They were still trying to build a perfect, gold-plated boat in 1938. Higgins knew that good enough and on time was the real path to victory. His impact on the war was so obvious that even Hitler recognized it. In his bunker, Hitler reportedly called Andrew Higgins the new Noah. He was the one man in America who had built the ark that was allowing the Allies to flood Fortress Europe. The U.S. Navy eventually learned its lesson. The Bureau of Ships was reorganized. The old admirals who had blocked Higgins were quietly retired. The not invented here syndrome, which had almost cost the Allies the war, was for a time burned out of the procurement system. Higgins's story is a perfect example of civilian innovation driving military victory. Like Ted Nelson's welding gun, the LCVP was a solution that came from outside the established rigid system. It came from a man who was focused on the problem, not the procedure. The U.S. Marine Corps, by championing Higgins, proved their own value. They were the ones who had defined the problem of amphibious assault. They were the ones who had the courage to tell the Navy that its solution was wrong and to fight for the right one. The LCVP was the linchpin. Without it, the Marine doctrine was just a theory. The boat was the missing piece that connected the doctrine to the reality of the battlefield. Higgins had not just built a boat. He had built the key that unlocked the entire Pacific campaign. When the war ended, Higgins' empire collapsed. The contracts were cancelled overnight. His attempts to build civilian housing and personal boats failed. He died in 1952, a man who had won the war but lost the peace. He was a production genius, not a peacetime administrator. But his legacy was immortal. Today, the D-Day Memorial in Normandy features a prominent full-size replica of an LCVP. It is given the same honor as the statues of soldiers, a recognition that the men were helpless without the machine. The rejection Higgins faced was not unique. Every military bureaucracy in history is guilty of it. They are designed to manage, not to innovate. They are designed to follow procedures, not to break them. But in war, innovation is procedure. Higgins, the gruff, profane, hard-drinking builder, was the perfect man for the moment. He was too stubborn to be intimidated by admirals and too smart to be fooled by their expert opinions. He knew his boat worked, and he bet his life on it. What if he had failed? What if the Bureau of Ships had won? The U.S. would have been forced to invade Japan's heavily fortified home islands, port by port. The casualty estimates for that invasion, Operation Downfall, were over 1 million American lives. The LCVP, by enabling the island-hopping campaign and by making the D-Day landings possible, had saved those lives. It had shortened the war, broken the back of the Axis, and proved that a simple plywood boat could be more important than a battleship. This is the essence of American innovation. It does not always come from the top down. It often comes from the bottom up. It comes from the civilian, the tinkerer, the outsider who is not afraid to tell the experts that they are wrong. The U.S. Navy, in its official history, now praises the LCVP, but it rarely mentions the 3-year-long bureaucratic war it waged to prevent the boat from ever being built. It is a history of resistance that was almost fatal. Andrew Higgins started as a boat builder for trappers. He ended as the man who, according to Eisenhower, won the war. He did it not by following orders, but by challenging them. He did it by building a better mousetrap when the nation needed it most. His legacy is a warning. It is a warning that bureaucracy, left unchecked, can become a greater threat than the enemy. It is a warning that following procedure can be a synonym for losing the war. The LCVP was not a complex piece of technology. It was simple, it was wood, and it was brilliant. Its brilliance was in its ramp, an idea so simple that the high-level engineers had missed it, but the man on the ground knew it was everything. When we remember D-Day, we remember the soldiers. When we remember Iwo Jima, we remember the Marines. But we must also remember the plywood boat that carried them there, and the stubborn, brilliant, and insufferable man who fought a bureaucracy to build it. The story of Andrew Higgins is not just about a boat. It is about the power of an individual to see a problem, invent a solution, and fight a system to get it done. It is the story of how one man's refusal to take no for an answer saved the world. The Navy admirals in 1938 looked at Higgins and saw an uneducated, loud-mouthed civilian. The Marines looked at him and saw a savior. The history of World War II proved the Marines were right. The LCVP was the physical proof that the user's needs are more important than the engineer's theories. The Marines needed to get off a boat, fast. Higgins built a boat that did just that. The Navy had built a boat that did what they wanted. This lesson, paid for in blood and time, is Higgins' true legacy. In warfare, the only thing that matters is what works, and the people who know what works are not always the ones with the rank. Sometimes it's the welder, and sometimes it's the boat builder from the bayou. The U.S. military of today is built on the lessons learned from men like Higgins and Nelson. The concept of rapid prototyping, of listening to user feedback from the field, of cutting through bureaucracy, this is all the legacy of innovators who had to fight their own side. Higgins' company, for all its wartime glory, did not survive, but the idea of the LCVP is immortal. Every modern landing craft, every amphibious assault vehicle, every ship-to-shore connector owes its existence to that first plywood boat with a ramp. The U.S. Navy, to its credit, learned. The post-war procurement system was reformed. The idea that a civilian contractor could be a partner, not just a subordinate, began to take hold. The not invented here syndrome, while never cured, was at least identified as a disease. The 25,000 workers at Higgins Industries were a microcosm of the arsenal of democracy. They were the proof that America's true strength was not its generals, but its people, its ability to mobilize, innovate, and produce on a scale the world had never seen. Higgins was the conductor of that orchestra. He harnessed the energy of an entire city, focused it on a single problem, and delivered a war-winning solution. He was the right man, with the right idea, at the exact right moment in history. When the war ended, Higgins was a national hero, but he was not a man who rested on his laurels. He immediately tried to pivot to building affordable housing using the same mass production techniques. He was always trying to solve the next problem. The LCVP remains one of the most important and yet most unsung heroes of the war. It was a weapon that was so common, so ubiquitous, that it became invisible. But without it, the entire Allied grand strategy would have been impossible. The story of Andrew Higgins is the ultimate David versus Goliath story, a single stubborn civilian entrepreneur against the entire U.S. Navy bureaucracy. In this case, David won, and in doing so, he gave the Allies the slingshot they needed to defeat the Axis. His legacy is a question for every generation. Where is the bureaucracy holding back the solution? Who is the outsider with the brilliant idea that everyone is ignoring? And do we have the courage to listen to them before it's too late? The invincible fortress of the Axis was broken by the simplest of machines, a machine that was dismissed by experts as crude, unprofessional, and not invented here. It is a powerful reminder that innovation does not come from a committee. The confidence of the U.S. Marines in 1938 was real, but it was based on a future they couldn't yet build. They had the doctrine, but not the tool. Andrew Higgins, the boat builder from New Orleans, heard their pleas, and built them the tool that won the war. The admirals in Washington had been prepared to sacrifice their men to their own procedures. Higgins was a man who broke procedures to save the men. His victory was not just over the Axis, it was over a rigid, peacetime mindset that had no place in a total war. The lesson from the Louisiana Bayou was simple. Listen to the end user. The loggers, the trappers, and the Marines all needed the same thing: a tough, fast, shallow draft boat that could hit a beach. The admirals in D.C. were the only ones who couldn't see it. The Higgins boat was not just a boat, it was a revolution. It was the physical manifestation of a new way of war, and it was the product of one man's stubborn, brilliant, and patriotic refusal to take no for an answer. The story of the LCVP began with a Marine's frustration on a Virginia beach. It ended with the total surrender of the Axis powers. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the simplest ideas, the ones dismissed by experts, are the ones that change the world. Andrew Higgins, the new Noah, had built an ark, not for a flood but for a war, an ark made of plywood, built in a swamp, that would carry democracy across every ocean and land it ramp down on the beaches of history.